It dominates the region both in size and grace. It is the first French cathedral declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is Our Lady of Chartres.
It's an exceptional cathedral that launched the era of giant cathedrals.
It's true technical perfection and a beautiful work of art.
Sculptor Auguste Rodin compared it to the Parthenon in Athens. Almost like magic, it was built in record time.
The work was done in 25 to 30 years. You could say it's the only cathedral ever built in one go.
How did they do it? The first tower was the second highest building in the world after the pyramids.
Whoever built that was an absolute genius.
And why is the taller second tower, 30 stories high, so different from the first?
It's a record-setting edifice, evidenced by the spire that reaches 113 meters above the ground.
The entire Gothic era was a race to set records. Always higher, always bigger, always more ample.
Beneath its roof lies a structure weighing 600 tons, 3 times the Statue of Liberty. What tragic event in 1836 led to its creation? And why was the cathedral disfigured and deprived of its rooftop?
Many people came to see what Victor Hugo had called a monster's back.
This mysterious masterpiece defies all attempts to understand its construction. With almost no historical records, scientists grasp for any clues they can find, including tiny splinters of wood clinging to the stone.
The wood is how we were able to give a precise date to the construction campaigns.
Now, computer-generated imagery and architectural historians reveal the secrets of Chartres, where genius builders revived ribbed vaulting and experimented with revolutionary flying buttresses. Here's the real story of this exceptional building, the grandest of all classic cathedrals, Our Lady of Chartres. The stunning Chartres Cathedral is located less than 100 kilometers southwest of Paris in an agricultural region known as the Beauce.
It's an attraction, a highlight in the local landscape.
The impression you get when you see the cathedral in the distance is that it's a massive citadel.
In Chartres, the cathedral is poised on a plateau that's bordered by the Eure River. A bird's-eye view of the cathedral clearly shows its Latin cross shape. The circular part of the cross is called the apse, and it's traditionally oriented to the east.
The orientation of a cathedral is very important. It must be facing east, because Christ is expected to return in the early morning light.
The main entrance is on the west side, which features a triple portal with statues carved out of the columns. The builders also designed 2 other entrances on the north and south sides of the monument. This part of the cathedral, the arms of the cross, is called the transept, and in Chartres, it was built to be impressive.
It's an unusually long transept, most likely designed for large processions that are typical of places of pilgrimage.
Many pilgrims are drawn to the cathedral's most important treasure, the Veil of Mary, which has been on display in Chartres since the 9th century. The interior volume of the building is breathtaking. It measures 130 meters in length, which is 3 meters more than Notre-Dame de Paris. With a nave that's over 16 meters wide, Chartres Cathedral broke a new record when it was built in the 1220s.
The idea was to have a cathedral that would surpass all the others in terms of size, effectiveness, and height.
Considered the ultimate classic cathedral, Our Lady of Chartres, built in the 13th century, was a unique construction project. While it took more than a century to build Notre-Dame de Paris, this monument was built in a mere 25 to 30 years.
You could say it's the only cathedral ever built in one go. That's unheard of, and it really makes you wonder.
By what miracle did they build such a structure in only 2 decades? There are many theories, and one of them can be explored just 10 kilometers from Chartres in Berchères-les-Pierres. Practically within arm's reach, this is where the builders found their primary source material.
Transporting stone over land is extremely slow and very expensive. Transportation often becomes more expensive than the material itself, so it's better if it's sourced nearby.
Stone from Berchères was easily accessible, but that's not the only reason the builders chose to use it.
The other reason is the stone's exceptional properties. It's resistant to freezing and friction, which means it can handle bad weather. That's why the Chartres Cathedral has needed very little restoration work.
Mostly used for structural work, stone from Berchères does have a downside that's visible when one looks closely.
It's an excellent stone for building, but it's not good at all for sculpting. There are holes in it, and it has an irregular surface, which means they had to import stone from Paris to do the sculptures, notably on the eastern side and the transepts.
To raise the building, the master builder chose to use very large blocks, sometimes up to 80 centimeters thick and 2 meters long, in a style similar to ancient Roman temple.
You can't forget that in the 12th century, when people were walking around France at that time, you often came upon ancient temples and ancient culture. It wasn't an abstract concept, it was a reality.
To lift such blocks, the masons used hoisting devices, like a 3-pulley crane, a system that could be easily set up and dismantled in any part of the construction site, as well as the squirrel.
A treadmill crane consists of a wheel with an individual inside, which allows hoisting extremely heavy materials with very little labor.
The cranes were moved from one scaffolding to another. Made of wood, the scaffoldings had to adapt to the ambitions of Gothic construction.
With the height of vaulted ceilings always growing, you couldn't build scaffolding that went from the ground all the way to the ceiling. It was too dangerous, and they didn't know how to build that kind of structure back then. So very early on, in the 12th century, they started building what's known as swing stages.
These wooden structures were directly attached to the rock, using what's called putlog holes. A system of diagonal and horizontal beams supported the platforms, which the masons used as a work floor. This type of scaffolding could be taken down, which was a necessity given the amount of wood needed for a building this size.
There was a wood shortage at the time, so they had to be frugal. This type of scaffolding is frugal by nature because it can be reused.
One stone after another, the cathedral began to take shape. Once it was over a dozen meters high, the builders used wooden anchors to keep the building in progress from falling. The anchors went from the pillars' tops to the walls, or from one pillar to another to hold them together. Like the scaffolding, these rectangular-shaped anchors were attached to the stone.
Once the mortar had dried, most of the anchors were cut flush with the walls and then covered and sealed to hide them.
To attach the stones at great heights, in addition to the usual mortar, the Chartres builders also used a material that may seem surprising: iron, and they used a lot of it.
There's a significant amount of iron, which was unusual for a building of that time, due to the quantity of staples that were systematically used throughout the masonry.
The staples can be seen throughout the cathedral, although many are hidden within the structure. Made by blacksmiths, these metal bars have bent tips on both ends. They can be up to 1 meter in length and weigh around 8 kilograms.
Once they were ready, they weren't put into place by blacksmiths. It was usually the masons who did that.
To do so, the masons dug 2 holes and pressed in the staple to hold the stone blocks together.
The staple was then sealed with another material that filled the free space between the hole, which was slightly bigger, and the leg of the staple. That material was often lead. Lead is a great isolator that doesn't allow humidity in.
Construction moved exceptionally fast. In addition to the stone from Berchères being nearby, the new building also had another thing working in its favor. It was built on the foundations of another cathedral from the 11th century. How could an ancient Romanesque building have served as the base for a structure as big as Our Lady of Chartres? To understand, we have to go beneath the monument, deep into the uniquely sized crypt.
The crypt of the Chartres Cathedral is not the widest crypt in the world, but it is the world's longest, and by far.
The main hall of the crypt is almost 250 meters long. The massive basement is due to the fact it originally belonged to Fulbert's cathedral, which was also monumentally large.
Fulbert was the prelate at the time it was built. He was a leading intellectual figure who insisted on having a large sanctuary, the likes of which France had never seen.
This is the only depiction available of Bishop Fulbert's cathedral, a cathedral that was vastly oversized for its time at over 101 meters long and 16 meters wide. The crypt has withstood the test of centuries. It is built in two parts. The first is on a lower level named the Crypt of Saint-Lubin. In the 11th century, the space was strictly reserved for the religious. Some of the cathedral's treasures were kept there.
The crypt of Saint-Lubin contained relics from ancient saints who were bishops or martyrs. These relics were protected and were believed to protect the cathedral in return by their simple presence.
To build this underground section, they could have simply used raw stone that was coated, but the architect of this sacred safe chose to build it out of carved stone.
It was pretty modern. They were exploring new building styles at the start of the 11th century, and one popular technique back then was opus quadratum. They used medium-sized stones, 20 to 30 centimeters, which could be easily carried.
Surrounding the crypt of Saint-Lubin, but at a higher level, was the second part of the crypt. It's slotted into the first with two long walkways called ambulatories, which converged in three Romanesque chapels. A true technical challenge for the 11th century architects.
People had known how to build arches since antiquity. What was extraordinary about this vaulting was that it continued over these large hallways in a turning movement. That required highly intentional stone laying and finishing. And the finishing allowed them to cover up any eventual errors they made in the masonry.
When it was built, the space was only for the faithful who visited the cathedral on a pilgrimage, usually to see the multiple relics.
People back then were very attracted to relics, going as far as searching for them in places where they didn't exist, like in the catacombs in Rome.
A pilgrimage to the crypt must have been extraordinary through these ambulatories that were bigger than anything else in existence.
The immense northern hallway went up through the southern gallery. That wasn't by chance. It was totally symbolic in the Christian faith to travel from the shadows up into the light.
As they moved from the shadows into the light, the pilgrims would pause before an iconic statue of the Virgin Mary. Another stop was before a 30-meter deep Gallo-Roman well, the Well of Strong Saints. Once a simple water source, it became tied to legends over time, like that of religious martyrs being thrown in by the Vikings.
It could have been made up, but the well was nevertheless a prominent attraction, and the 17th century canons did everything they could to stop the veneration of this well, which they saw as a pagan relic that had nothing to do with Christianity.
Despite its spiritual renown and impressive dimensions, Fulbert's cathedral eventually gave way to Our Lady of Chartres after a fire in 1194. Although shrouded in mystery, this tragedy happened at just the right time.
Fulbert's cathedral could no longer meet the spiritual needs of the time, nor was it up to the standards of a city that wanted to host a diocese.
You couldn't even conceive keeping the cathedral as it was. It was past prime and out of style.
As big as it was, Fulbert's Romanesque cathedral looked out of place in the late 12th century. Since the 1140s, other cathedrals had begun to be built in a brand new architectural style, Gothic. In 1195, when work began in Chartres, the Notre-Dame de Paris cathedral was already underway, so they needed to stand out.
Chartres had the prestige, the means, and the desire to build something a lot more significant than all the others.
In their quest to push back the limits, the builders in Chartres had the advantage of not beginning with a clean slate. The fire at Fulbert's cathedral had spared its facade, which was slightly smaller than the one we see today, the impressive southern tower and a northern tower that had no spire. Part of the Romanesque apse and its unfinished vault remained standing, and the giant crypt had also been spared, a godsend for Chartres.
It meant they didn't have to start from scratch for the foundations. The crypt was simply lying, meaning reinforced to support the much bigger structure that came after Fulbert's cathedral.
And so the blueprints of Fulbert's cathedral were the basis for the new cathedral. The master architect in Chartres added elements, including 4 Gothic chapels in between the other Romanesque chapels.
Ogival vault chapels were added in between the 3 protruding Fulbert chapels. Those chapels were necessary because they serve as the foundation for the chapels of the Gothic superstructure.
In the crypt, the additions are clearly visible. One goes from ancient Romanesque-style barrel vaults to the neighboring and more complex chapel in Gothic style. The exterior windows of the Romanesque chapels thus become the interior windows for the newly added chapels.
This obscured the main light source in the crypt, which means that the crypt as you see it today is much darker than it was in the 11th century.
Besides the new chapels, the biggest modification to Fulbert's cathedral was the addition of the 2 arms of the cross, the transepts, at an extremely sensitive location for the new cathedral.
Erecting the transept was a bit of a problem. While the entire cathedral rested on Fulbert's crypt, with its compact foundations that had been dry for several decades, the new prominent transept required new foundations.
There was a risk that the transept would detach from the rest of the building, something we're seeing these days with the Amiens Cathedral. But in Chartres, the builders had taken that risk into consideration.
It was a real problem that the master builder was able to address using his massive structure. So the new monument was quickly compacted.
Once the foundations were laid, what came next? For a long time, due to the loss of all historic records, the experts had multiple theories. The first implied that construction began at the back of the cathedral and advanced progressively towards the main facade, ending with the transepts. The second theory was the opposite, first the facade and then the apse. A third hypothesis was a progression along horizontal trenches with simultaneous work on all parts of the building. In fact, it wasn't until 1990, some 700 years later, that one theory began to stand out. During a restoration project, workers discovered remnants of wooden anchors in the putlog holes. A laboratory analysis of the fragments revealed the answer.
The wood is how we were able to give a precise date to the construction campaigns. The wooden fragments of the anchors found in the nave made it possible for us to understand that the wood was cut around 1195.
The builders thus began with the front of the cathedral in 1195, which makes sense given that the ancient chevet was intact after the fire. A chevet that proved useful for the cannons when construction began.
It had been more or less spared from the fire, so they used it as a temporary church. Then, once enough of the nave was built, the canons held provisional services in the nave, which became the second temporary church.
When the canons gathered in the partially completed nave, they got an early taste of their future cathedral. Our Lady of Chartres was meant to embody two key Gothic trends, maximum space and maximum light, to provide a most beautiful vision of what awaited the faithful in heaven. A vision that only became more spectacular from one cathedral to another.
The entire Gothic era was a race to set records. Chartres was no exception to the rule. Always higher, always bigger, always more ample.
Why make it taller? Why did these northern cathedrals always have to be taller? There's a spiritual explanation, of course, but another reason is they sought to prove to the world that they were capable of extraordinary technological skills.
What technological skills did they have to display when the walls were over 30 meters tall? Back in the Middle Ages, the homes only comprised one floor, two at the most. How could they support the weight of the incredibly large roofs? One of the solutions can be seen by shifting one's gaze to the cathedral's ceiling, which rests upon one of the main supporting elements, a pointed arch.
The pointed arch allows to open the space up on itself. Whether you're in the nave or in the aisles, you can always see the stained glass from either angle, because these large arches are wide and very high.
Up until the 12th century, religious edifices tended to resort to a type of vault known as barrel vaults. These have circular arches. They exert strong lateral pressure along the entire length of the walls, so the walls must be particularly thick to avoid collapsing.
That had been the failure of the Romanesque world up until then, meaning you had to choose between a luminous wooden nave or a vaulted nave with smaller-sized windows.
Starting in the 12th century, widespread use of the pointed arch changed the game. With this technique, pressure is no longer against the outside walls, but against the pillars that support the arch. Less weight on the walls means they can be built thinner.
From then on, you no longer saw these massive vaults supported by the entire length of the walls, but rather just certain points where the pressure was focused. It changed everything.
It changed everything, because this meant the walls could have much bigger openings.
The wall almost disappeared, replaced by light coming in through the stained glass windows.
In Chartres, this new light was so impressive that it made the neighboring cathedral 80 kilometers away green with envy.
In Paris, in the 13th century, they enlarged the windows in Notre-Dame because after seeing Chartres, they appeared far too small.
To build these pointed arches intercrossing at their high point, builders used wooden camber beams. The first stones were then temporarily placed on top of them until the cornerstone rock was added to hold everything together. Then the camber beams were removed, leaving the crossing pointed arches. A cross that's different in Chartres than in the first wave of Gothic architecture.
In the first Gothic-style cathedrals, the spans in the main nave were square, with the vaults separated into 6 parts. In Chartres, they made the spans in the main nave rectangular, with vaults comprising 4 parts. That change allowed them to simplify the overall construction.
Contrary to 6-part ogival vaults, these are less curved, require fewer resources, and are much lighter.
These cost-efficient vaults freed up more space and were naturally taller than in any other cathedral.
In Chartres, they had almost 37 meters of height beneath the vaults, and that was a new record.
The same technique is used to create large open spaces throughout the cathedral. But while crossing pointed arches were a huge advance in the art of construction, they were not enough to stabilize such big buildings. How could they keep it from crumbling like a house of cards beneath the weight of its vaults? Thanks to a basic tenet, the flying buttress.
How did they do it? They followed their gut and experience. There were probably no calculations or vectorizations like an architectural engineer would do today. But talk about gut and experience.
And yet it was not commonplace, because even though flying buttresses seem perfectly natural in our eyes today, at the start of the Gothic era, they were in hot debate.
In the beginning, people were shocked, to the extent that some architects in the mid-12th century used flying buttresses, but tried to hide them.
Some hid the flying buttresses, others outright refused to use them.
Why didn't they want to use them? Because flying buttresses are a handicap. They obscure the monument. They didn't see a flying buttress as a token of building prowess, but rather as a sort of bandage or crutch for the structure.
This crutch has since become essential as the structure of churches has evolved. In Romanesque churches, to counteract the vault's pressure on the walls, the latter were reinforced with buttresses attached on the outside. In Gothic cathedrals with a simple nave, buttresses would have been enough. However, the presence of the aisles on either side of the nave meant that the upper part of the nave couldn't be directly supported. In the absence of classic buttresses and tribunes above the aisles, they needed to find another way to support the vaults.
The main reason they used flying buttresses was to keep the cathedral from exploding.
A flying buttress is a circular arch. The arch redirects the pressure on the wall towards an abutment pillar. In short, it works as a prop, a stone support structure against the exterior walls of the cathedral. And to ensure even more stability for the abutment, the builders also added a pinnacle on top, which weighed the flying buttress down.
The vaults didn't rest on a single point, but rather on an area that was several meters high. That's why in Chartres, you have two arches that are connected to each other like beautiful bicycle spokes. The flying buttress is two arches.
In Chartres, the master builder didn't skimp on the flying buttresses, neither in their quantity nor their weight, notably in relation to the nave.
The nave is built using a model where the flying buttresses are massive, making the abutment of the flying buttress very powerful. The number of tons of stones used is unbelievable.
This mass of flying buttresses could also well indicate that the architect was afraid. You can sense it in the flying buttresses, beyond their massive size, that it was still an experiment to a certain degree.
This experimentation is flagrant all around the cathedral. For this reason, the first flying buttresses placed around the nave are simpler in form than those that came later during the construction.
In the chancel, you can see that the support bearings of the arches are much lighter. The small columns were replaced by wheel spokes, which conveniently also let more air circulate through.
Not only did the master builder perfect the design of the flying buttresses, but he also displayed them proudly by sculpting them and adding recesses. Later during the construction, he adapted the structure due to the wind at the top of the cathedral.
You can see that the first master builder hadn't anticipated that, because they added a third flight in hindsight, out of the nave's first flying buttress, that acted as a counterbearing for the weight of the roofs.
With the flying buttresses and the crossed-pointed arches, the builders created an impressive open space. The walls are not only higher but also thinner, meaning they can have multiple openings. This enabled them to embody a key Gothic trend, a maximum amount of light. But how would they make such large, cutting-edge windows?
The amount of surface area for the windows was simply immense, and the entire decor was designed around the 150 windows in the Chartres Cathedral.
Our Lady of Chartres features an exceptional surface area of medieval stained glass, 2,600 square meters. In comparison, Notre-Dame de Paris only has about 1,000.
Such quantity is unique on Earth. A little over 3/4 of the original stained glass have been preserved, which is exceptional.
To make that much stained glass, they had to call on multiple modest workshops, usually comprising one master glass maker and a few assistants. Using instructions given by the canons, the master designed a full-scale model over which he laid the various pieces of glass.
Back then, they didn't have big pieces of glass, so it was assembled out of many small pieces, like a mosaic.
The mosaics cost a small fortune and represented a significant part of the total construction budget, which is why there are images of guildsmen and nobles who helped finance certain panels. Among the cathedral's many stained glass windows is one that stands out. It's nicknamed the Mona Lisa of all stained glass, and it predates the current monument as it survived the fire in the former cathedral. It contains a very particular blue color, which may have been chosen for its good price.
There was a Romanesque blue made with cobalt, a metal oxide that came from the Orient. It was extremely expensive, so when they needed square meter upon square meter of blue glass, they decided to use manganese instead, which gives it a purple-blue color.
The master glass maker would then compose his image using all these pieces in various colors before adding the final touch to complete the piece.
The last step, which is very important, is to paint the glass with a grey mixture of glass and metal paste, like an enamel. It's used to paint lines on the glass, which creates the outlines and details.
Inside the cathedral are over 1,000 different images to behold. Some tell famous stories from the Bible, while others are more scholarly, but all of them have the same ultimate end goal.
All Middle-aged theologists believed that light passing through the glass was an act of incarnation. God came into humanity through light, and that's how we can see him on Earth.
The sunlight passes through these windows, but it doesn't stop there. To reflect the light filtered through the stained glass windows, the builders added another element, something that had been forgotten beneath the dirt that covered the walls with age.
The Chartres Cathedral got dirty because of the soot created by the candles and the heating installed in the 19th century. So the church had turned black. But a black church doesn't work. A church needs to be luminous to match its liturgical message.
During a recent restoration campaign, the workers cleaning up the soot inadvertently revealed a colored coating.
The monument had been painted 3 times, twice in the Middle Ages. The first coat was a thick-colored coat of beige with simulated joints painted white.
The colored coating played many roles. It filled in the stone's unevenness, protected the walls, damped the acoustics, and it also had the symbolic effect of diffusing divine light. An effect that extended outside the cathedral to the exterior walls.
The entire cathedral was painted, and it was so well done that when a pilgrim arrived on the flat plains of Beauce and saw the cathedral from afar, it reflected all of the light, both by day and by night when the moon was full. Don't forget that in the Middle Ages, a building that was that well lit simply didn't exist.
With its unique colors and luminosity for a Middle-Age edifice and its grandiose volume, Our Lady of Chartres stood proudly when it was completed around 1225. A century later, a new chapel sprang up, the Saint-Pierre Chapel. Already independent, it was later connected to the cathedral by a staircase. In the 15th century, an extension in the nave created another space for prayer, the Vendôme Chapel. But it was the 16th century that an important element was added, the steeple on the North Tower. Why a new tower, and why so high?
The spire reached 113 meters above the ground. That new construction once again put Chartres on the cutting edge of innovation and back in the record height-setting game.
The reason for the new expansion of Our Lady of Chartres was that in 1506, it once again fell victim to fire.
This time, it was the northern bell tower that caught fire. The north tower was still unfinished. It had been crowned with a wooden and iron bell tower, so they called it Jean de Beauce, one of the greatest architects of the time, to finish the last level of the tower, topped with a very high steeple.
It was a huge challenge for Jean de Beauce to build a tower taller than the South Tower while maintaining the original base, a perilous exercise that had failed at a neighboring cathedral.
Jean de Beauce had to keep the native tower intact and build on top of it. If the tower's base had cracked, the whole thing could have collapsed, which is exactly what happened at the Bourges Cathedral.
Jean de Beauce began construction in a style radically shifting from that of the base, the flamboyant Gothic style.
It was incredibly ornate and fantastical, with dragons, mythical creatures, and vegetal elements. The designs had a level of technical complexity that was such that it required prodigious effort from his sculptors.
The flamboyant style was by nature the opposite of the simple Romanesque base. But the architect had a trick to ensure a smooth transition between them.
If he had gone all out in flamboyant style on top, then the whole thing would have looked completely awkward from the ground. That's why he added decorative elements a few meters down from the separation, to ensure a smooth and gradual transition between the two styles of decoration.
Adapting its style to fit the times is one thing, but how were they going to complete a cylindrical steeple on top of a square tower base? Jean de Beauce did it by using an ingenious series of stacked offset octagons.
It's a series of octagons that are slightly pivoted. Every edge met in the middle of the edge from the octagon below it. It's so subtle that it's almost impossible to tell among all the decor when you look at the steeple.
To support the octagons, Jean de Beauce designed a system of particularly discreet and aesthetic flying buttresses which direct one's eye towards the sky. First, he built 4 flying buttresses, one on each edge of the first square level. Then, on top, just slightly pivoted in comparison to the level below, he added another series of 8 flying buttresses. Finally, to solidify the structure without destabilizing the whole tower, he designed a steeple that had reinforcements on every edge.
The steeple was a real challenge, and to keep it from being too heavy, it was built with a system of ribs that distributed the weight across the entire octagonal base.
Next to the North Tower's flamboyant Gothic style, the facade's other tower displays the ultimate simplicity. It's 3 centuries older than the bigger North Tower, and yet it still represents an exceptional technical feat. Just what is so admirable about the older Southern Tower?
I've seen some of the world's greatest architects look at that tower and say, whoever built that was an absolute genius.
We know nothing about this genius, except that he began his masterpiece in the middle of the 12th century, embellishing Fulbert's cathedral with a tower that's both massive and light.
It has a square base with very imposing walls. At ground level, the walls are more than 2.5 meters thick. Yet at the very top, the walls are extremely thin. They are barely 20 centimeters thick at the very top.
The South Tower rests on 3 square base levels. Then, the fourth level becomes an octagonal structure that is topped with the last level, the steeple. The architectural challenge lay in the part above the first square levels. Just like the northern tower, it had to gradually and smoothly become a cylindrical steeple. To disguise this geometric shift, the architect placed different sized and shaped gables between the third and the fourth levels of the tower.
These steeples facing the corners accompany the movement of the structure, like the boosters on the side of a rocket before it blasts off. The very sharp angles of the gables prepare the eye for that final point of the topmost steeple.
When it was built in the 12th century, this steeple was one of the world's tallest monuments after the pyramids of Egypt. And the masons had to work at dizzying heights for the times, the equivalent of a modern 30-story building.
You have to remember they were built from the inside, with interior scaffolding at a height that required an exceptional level of skill.
To assemble the stones of the steeple, which had to withstand brutal winds without any additional support from a frame, the builders resorted to using staples.
We couldn't do a complete analysis, but we did notice that the majority of the foundation stones that make up the steeple feature staples. That means it's not just mason work, it's reinforced mason work.
For the steeple's exterior, the architect designed a system of scales carved into the rock. The scale motif began a bit above the start of the steeple's cylinder, yet again ensuring a smooth visual transition. But that's not all.
It's beautifully decorated. But from a technical perspective, the scales have the exact same effect as a fish's scales, meaning they each slightly cover the mortar joint of the scales below. So they actually make the structure durably waterproof, even though it was touched up in the 19th and 20th century restorations.
A scale-covered tower on one side and a dragon tower on the other. At the start of the 16th century, the two differently styled steeples gave the cathedral a new look and a highly successful, unique silhouette. So successful, in fact, that when Jean de Beauce finished the North Tower, he was given another project.
Jean de Beauce also designed a small pavilion, a clock pavilion at the foot of the steeple, aimed at housing all the clock's mechanisms for ringing the bells on the steeple's summit. After that, they gave him another, more surprising project.
His next challenge was this section, reserved for canons who pray here 7 times a day.
They didn't want to be distracted from their private rituals by people walking from relic to relic, looking at every statue. So they enclosed themselves in a liturgical chancel.
The chancel's enclosure of Our Lady of Chartres was originally built out of wood, but 3 centuries later, it no longer reflected the great ambitions of the cathedral.
The old chancel's tower was no longer up to par by the 16th century. The new chancel tower was meant to rival those of other great cathedrals and go beyond those that had been built in the Middle Ages, like the one in Paris, for example. It was a matter of prestige.
The canons chose all of the sculptures that were to be created. Most of them depict scenes from the lives of Mary and Christ. But there were also bishops and other secular personalities, some 200 statues in all. And to ensure they would rival the cathedrals in Paris and Amiens, no expense was spared.
There are ornamental sculptures absolutely everywhere, and it was all made with the best stone money could buy.
The canons went as far as to accompany the sculptors to quarries outside the region to choose the best stones. They were extremely demanding, and Jean de Beauce was even called to order after a few years of construction.
They told him, listen, you've been respecting the schedule, that's good. You've done beautiful work. From a technical standpoint, we have no complaints. But the style is completely outdated. This can't go on. Sorry.
Jean de Beauce had to shift from his ornate Gothic style to a simpler Renaissance style. In the end, this masterpiece of French sculpture measured 100 meters long and more than 6 meters tall, a colossal amount of work for a colossal project. one that Jean de Bos would actually never see finished.
It took more than 2 centuries to complete the entire chancel tower. It took until the 18th century to finish the final statues.
The inside of the chancel would later be upgraded before the French Revolution in a Baroque style made of gildings and marble. That was when the cathedral was finally completed, and the story could have ended there. Except that Our Lady of Chartres had an Achilles heel hovering over everyone's head, its wooden frame. What revolutionary choice was made in Chartres when the cathedral suffered the same fate as Notre-Dame de Paris in 2019?
It was Saturday, June the 4th, 1836. A heating device of some sort was left on by one of the roofers, and the chimney effect of the attic resulted in everything burning extremely fast.
The fire was so intense that homes near the cathedral began to catch fire too. Residents worked alongside firefighters to try and contain the blaze. Firefighters took extraordinary risks to keep other parts of the structure from collapsing.
The firefighters held on during an extremely close call in an attempt to keep the steeples from collapsing. Their heroism is what saved the vaults in their entirety.
The next morning, the steeples and the vaults had been saved, but Our Lady of Chartres was badly disfigured.
The fire had an obvious and radical impact on the structure.
It was something extraordinary. Many people came to see what Victor Hugo had called a monster's back.
To keep the monster from taking on water, they quickly decided to pour a concrete cover over the vaults. But once the emergency repairs had been made, like at Notre-Dame de Paris, a fundamental question arose: what would replace the former woodwork that had burned down?
To put it in context, at that time the Industrial Revolution was taking place and people had incredible faith in progress and in new materials. So they decided to take advantage of the moment and restore the cathedral using modern means and materials.
A choice that wasn't just modern, but also bold. They chose to replace the chestnut wood of the former woodwork with 600 tons of metal.
It was a technological masterpiece, but also a spatial masterpiece.
In the 1830s, a cathedral with a metal frame was unheard of.
They clearly chose to do something futuristic. This was 40 years before the Eiffel Tower.
This futuristic roof was laid on the Gothic walls, which needed to be reinforced following the fire. The fastening systems were inspired by British metal bridges, a point of reference at the time. The entire structure rested on a single main element, a couple of cast iron beams called trusses. These beams, which were shaped to resemble the pointed arches of the cathedral's interior, were relatively stiff in order to limit bending, but sufficiently slanted to shift the weight to the exterior walls.
The genius of this achievement lies in the fact that all of the weight was channeled directly to the exterior, and that created an entirely open space.
The trusses were connected to one another by several rows of anchors so as to prevent lateral movement. Other anchors below kept the trusses from separating beneath the weight of the roof or from contracting in the wind, which can be powerful at such heights. On top of the trusses, another series of metal rods formed a V upon which the roof rested. A very different roof, as the lead that had melted in the fire was replaced by a new, rather unfamiliar material, copper.
Why did they choose copper? They had a surplus of copper plates left over from the ancient regime. These copper plates were originally meant for the naval industry as hull armor for vessels sailing in warm seas.
After the tragedy of 1836, they wanted to build quickly, cheaply, and to reduce the risk of fire. With that in mind, the new frame and roof ensemble fit the bill perfectly. Why did the designers work so hard on the structure's shape when that part of the cathedral is practically invisible to the general public?
They really had an aesthetic goal in mind. It was also done in the spirit of cathedral builders, who are known to create exceptional things that one can barely see.
This metal roof marked the final chapter in the architectural tale of this great cathedral. It's in line with the spirit of Gothic-era builders and reflects the same great ambitions.
They built the lightest, most technical, most innovative structures of the time. And on top of that, they boldly boasted that it would last for centuries. And they were right.
From this metallic rooftop built in the 19th century to the ancient Well of Strong Saints, Our Lady of Chartres embodies an epic historic tale which continues to be written in the crypt with its contemporary stained glass windows. A story of faith, but also of power, money, art, and architecture. And lest we forget, it's also a living space with almost 1.5 million visitors every year. Heritage enthusiasts and believers from around the world gather before the Virgin Mary, like many others have done long before them. The monument itself also lives on. Every stone and every piece of metal interacts with its surrounding environment, as pollution and humidity constantly put the building to the test. But many people are passionate about preserving this incredible edifice that has withstood centuries of wars, storms, and multiple fires with quite a bit of luck, given its exceptional condition. Thanks to the talented builders who built it, thanks to the love of those who care for it today, Our Lady of Chartres continues to be a beacon in the local landscape and in our spirits 800 years later.